Okay, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to EAPN's first ever online policy conference. I'm Leo Williams. I'm the director of the European Anti-Poverty Network, and we're thrilled to be organizing this conference today to explore the impacts of COVID-19 on poverty and to focus on ensuring that the poor don't pay for this crisis. We've got some fantastic speakers with us today. We have some speakers representing views from the ground. We have the author of our newly launched study on the impact of COVID-19 on people experiencing poverty. You'll know that I hope this conference is also the launch of this study. It was just launched just a few minutes ago. And we also have representatives from the European Commission, from the German presidency of the EU Council, from the European Parliament, from trade unions, and from civil society. A quick word on interpretation. You should be able to click on the interpretation button on the black band at the bottom of your screen, and you could choose between English or Spanish. You might like to check that it's working at this stage because some colleagues will be speaking in Spanish. I'll say a couple of words about housekeeping in a minute, but before doing so, we'd like to get a sense of who's with us at this conference today. It's always useful to know who we're speaking with and who we're speaking to, so we've prepared a quick question which should pop up on your screen in a second. And I'd ask you just to take a few seconds to let us know if you're here representing a government, a European institution, a civil society organization, a trade union, academia, or if you're here as an individual. I'm hoping that you will see the poll in front of your screen. Okay, so the poll should have appeared on your screen. So I'm hoping that you can just take a few seconds and let us know who you are. We can see that there's well over 100 people on the call already, and we had over 200 registered. So we're hoping to have a good participation today. Okay, great. I'll just leave it a few more seconds. I can see that most people have voted already. Okay, we can see that almost 80% of you have voted so far, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results briefly with you. So you should all be able to see this with you. So we can see that of, I think about 80% of people voted. So of the 115 people we have so far on the call, we see that about 64% are from civil society organizations. Welcome. We have 7% from governments, 4% from the European Parliament, 2% from the Commission, some trade unions, some individuals, 4% from academic institutions, and some others as well. Okay, so now we have a sense of who's here with us today. Hopefully we can start the exchange of views. So we're here today for two main reasons. And as I said, but firstly is to launch the EAPN study on the impact of COVID-19 on people experiencing poverty. The report is now online. It was launched earlier today, and I'm hoping you should be able to see it on your screens shortly. Secondly, the idea is to discuss and exchange with decision makers and stakeholders how to build on short-term measures addressing the immediate impacts of COVID-19 towards embedding an effective anti-poverty strategy based on strong welfare states and quality jobs. And we've got a great program designed to do just that. And again, this is about to come up on your screen, I'm hoping shortly. But before this, a couple of words of housekeeping then. So first of all, we encourage all of you to use Twitter throughout the meeting today. We'll put a couple of key hashtags and handles in the chat box in a couple of minutes. Please do feel free to tweet away directly. The key hashtags are Fight Poverty and Fight COVID-19. Next, in order to keep background noise to a minimum and to enable everybody to hear, participants are going to be muted unless they're speakers or they're asking a question directly. So we'd ask you to respect this and to allow the organizers to unmute you directly if you're brought in for a question. As I said, then we'll take questions at key points. And if you would like to ask a question to a specific panelist or speaker, please type your question into the chat box during the presentation. The chat box will be monitored by the staff team of EAPN, and then we'll bring in specific colleagues to ask their question directly. Please do keep your questions concise and to the point so we can take more questions. and we would invite you to switch your video on if and when you're called upon to ask the question. But as I said, we'll only have the videos of the speakers in order to save bandwidth. Participants should please keep their videos off unless called upon to ask the question, or unless, of course, you're presenting. We're also live streaming on Facebook, and if anybody doesn't want their image to appear there, you should also keep your video switched off if you're asking a question. Okay, so without further ado then, I'll pass the word to Carlos Suzias, the president of the European Anti-Poverty Network. Carlos will speak in Spanish, so if you need interpretation, now is the moment to turn your interpretation on using the button at the bottom. Carlos, welcome. Please tell us a little more about the conference and the reasons that we're organizing it. Thanks. You have 5 minutes, Carlos.
Muchas gracias, Leo. Muchas gracias a todas.
Thank you very much, Leo. Thank you to everybody. Thank you for all of you, all of those attending this conference at a very significant time, at a very special moment. So firstly, I'd like to thank all of the panelists, all of the speakers who will be contributing this afternoon. And I would particularly like to thank Nicholas Schmidt from the European Commission and Olivier de Schutter, the Special Rapporteur. He was just appointed very recently in his new role as Special Rapporteur to the United Nations. And then, of course, we have representatives from the Ministry of Germany as well. And thanks to all of the other speakers as well. Now, just to start, I would point out by saying that 30 years ago, a group of activists set up EAPN. At that time, we did not think that 30 years later, we would be in a situation that we're seeing right now. Not just because we are seeing such high levels of poverty in Europe right now, but also because now we are mired in a crisis. Firstly, a health crisis. It continues to be a health crisis. We're not over the health crisis. We haven't been able to turn our backs on COVID yet, but there's also a social and economic crisis. So to the health problems, we can add these other social and economic problems. Now, it's true that we have had previous crises. We had a previous economic and financial crisis, which we were able to overcome in macroeconomic terms. But then that's macroeconomic terms. On the lower level, people, day-to-day people, we're not able to overcome that financial and economic crisis. So now we have poverty that was already existing before. Now we have poverty plus COVID, plus more widespread poverty and more deep-rooted poverty. And hopefully we can discuss solutions to that. I hope that all of you are in good health and that all of your loved ones are in good health. And at the EXCO, unfortunately, we have witnessed COVID itself and its impacts, and hopefully we're all in good health as best possible now. And so now we can see unequal developments in the European Union. There's unequal measures being taken by the different countries in the European Union, and the citizens are receiving different treatment. So we're not all receiving the same treatment. Those who had precarious work, who are unemployed, those who had unstable jobs have received poor treatment. Then there are children who maybe don't have a computer or a tablet to do their schooling at home. There's also school feeding, school food provided. Then there are those suffering disabilities, then domestic violence, those who are in a variety of different situations in their homes and who have suffered for different reasons the lockdown and the impact of COVID. And so we can see that COVID-19 is affecting specific sectors in Europe, many more than others. Certain groups within society are being much more affected than others. And several packages of measures have been developed to help the most vulnerable indeed, but most of these packages are temporary. When we look at EAPN, for 30 years, we've been saying the problems of poverty in Europe are structural problems. Therefore, the solution cannot just be a one-off thing. It should be a structural permanent, ongoing, long-lasting solution, which is there for the long term. These should not just be short-term measures, because otherwise we cannot actually solve the real problems that we're facing. Then also we should point out that the President of the European Commission, von der Leyen, before COVID said that we have to do more to combat COVID-19. And we were very pleased to hear that. And also the Commissioner Schmidt spoke up along similar lines, saying that interventions are necessary. And of course, we will continue to focus on the European Pillar of Social Rights. Now, following COVID-19, following the impacts of COVID-19, these measures are all that have gained a lot more importance, and we can see that the European Commission, European Union, and Europe on its whole, in the whole, should take on new measures. The Europe 2020 strategy establishes the objective of reducing poverty among 20 million people, and we have seen some steps forward in some areas, but we can say that this aim has not been met, and far from it. There are shared objectives, shared measures being attempted somewhat, and if we want to provide clear follow-up in these strategies, then really what we need is a Europe-wide approach, a pan-European approach. Therefore, we need common strategies, shared strategies and measures for the whole of the European Union. Now, this is not just as a result of COVID-19. Let me repeat this. I would like to reiterate this once again. COVID-19 has only exacerbated the problems which already existed, which were structural problems and which require structural solutions. And in 2017, the European Pillar of Social Rights was adopted. We consider this a landmark, a great achievement. Now, it does have measures to guide the European Union and to guide member states in the right direction, but the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Council, the European institutions are the ones that have to take on a greater effort to materialize, to put into practice these social rights that are discussed. And so we have been coming together with members of the Commission, those who work at the Commission, and we definitely recognize the eager efforts that they have been showing. And we have to be clear that we need clear objectives, clear outcomes that we need to aim for. One clear objective is to reduce poverty by 50%. And this is a key part of the strategy which we hope can be reached. Another urgent aspect is to have structural impact measures which can allow us to fully overcome poverty. There are some key points here. Acting on salaries and income. Jobs and labor should be dignified. And we need decent work. We need guarantees in this direction, but we also need a guarantee for the quality of living standards, guarantees for all of those who are in a situation in which they do not have jobs, or they do not have access, or they are not able to access work, or for whatever reason they cannot work. Therefore, in the European Union, we need a global commitment, an overarching commitment for minimum incomes, and EAPN has been working in this direction for many years. The objectives of this conference today will last roughly 2.5 hours. So firstly, we're going to present the findings of the EAPN study on the impact of COVID-19, and I would like to specifically congratulate the European Union Inclusion Strategies Group of EAPN. This is a very powerful group. It is very well qualified, very well informed. They carried out very reasonable, very well elaborated strategies, making very positive proposals. So thank you very much for all of the members of the European Union Inclusion Strategies Group of EAPN for all of the work that you're doing. And another objective of this seminar is to think about how we can build on short-term measures so that we can work on an effective strategy for overcoming poverty in the long term. So public services, employment are important here, and we need to come together with other stakeholders in order to achieve this. So I'm very grateful to all of those who are attending here today, who are listening, and I will now wrap up here by thanking all of the efforts of EAPN, members of staff for organizing this, and all of the members of EAPN that have come together to ensure that this is a success. This success is really down to making proposals, proper proposals that can be implemented and which can benefit people across Europe. Now, these are measures that should benefit the whole of Europe, which should benefit all of us individually. Inclusion strategies are something that we all need to aim for. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Carlos. We're going to move straight on to the first session then, which is going to see Graciela Maglesini from EAPN Spain and the author of the study Carlos just referred to, who will launch and present this study on the impact of COVID-19 on people experiencing poverty, before hearing directly from Sonja Lemkool from EAPN Netherlands about her lived direct experience as to how COVID has impacted her and her communities and her network. We'll then pass to Commissioner Schmidt and then to Olivier de Schutter, the new UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, to hear their reactions. We'll then have some time for questions. So as I said at the start, please do remember to use the chat box during the interventions to highlight the questions that you may have. And my colleagues will be monitoring that chat box for this reason. So Graciela, over to you, please, to tell us about the study and maybe with a specific focus on the key recommendations. You've got 20 minutes, Graciela, and I think there's a PowerPoint which will be shared as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the possibility of talking about this in this very important seminar with so many important people and colleagues. Slide, please. EAPN decided to carry out detailed research into the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on people living in poverty and vulnerability, with the participation of 25 of its national networks and 3 European member organizations during the months of April to June. Slide, please. Before the pandemic, insufficient investment and sustained cuts in healthcare provision generated structural shortcomings of trained medical staff, facilities, and equipment, which translated into hardships and waiting lists for specialized medical services. Mental health services and dental care were underdeveloped in most of the countries. Low-income groups and migrants had more unmet medical care needs than the rest of the population. High prices of medicines and medical services negatively impacted on the health of people in poverty. Slide. In many countries, income transfers had a very low impact on poverty reduction. In fact, the 2020 Joint Employment Report highlighted the decreasing ability of social transfers to reduce poverty in 16 member states, mainly due to the inadequate benefit levels. The complexity of the social protection systems prevented people with needs from claiming the benefits they were entitled to. During the last decade, there was a tightening of eligibility criteria and reductions in the level of working age benefits. Pensions for the elderly were very low, particularly for women. Problems of social protection of persons with disabilities and in situations of dependency were generalized. Child benefits amounts were low or had insufficient coverage in many countries. Even in countries with good coverage, there were setbacks in the recent years. Slide, please. Minimum income schemes were considered challenging in many ways for most of the countries. There were outstanding territorial differences. Many vulnerable groups could not access them due to restrictive criteria, due to age, origin, etc. The complexity of the procedures, means tested access, the long waiting time to get the first payment, the stigmatization of recipients, and other barriers also caused low take-up levels. Due to the inadequacy of amounts, most of the recipients were placed below the poverty line. Negative activation and conditionality were increasing trends as well. Slide, please. Deficiencies of coverage and adequacy of the healthcare, social protection, and income guarantee systems of the country before the eruption of COVID-19 favored the spread of the pandemic and the avalanche of negative social consequences on those already poor or at risk of becoming poor and vulnerable. Slide, please. These measures, judged positively in general, had a negative impact on people experiencing poverty who started in a situation of disadvantage with regard to other groups of the population due to poverty, for example, for indebtedness, lack of savings, precarious jobs, if any jobs at all, low amount benefits as main household income, because of prevalent diseases and disabilities, poorly perceived physical health, mental health problems, and low well-being level, insecure housing or homelessness. And also because they were victims of racial inequalities and poverty as BAME, Roma, and migrants. Slide, please. The vulnerabilities of the healthcare systems were highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, but this crisis also brought solutions for some of those difficult situations prior to the crisis. And for example, it was more important the preparedness for further emergencies and more investment in healthcare, which is now considered crucial. And in some countries, privatization processes have stopped, at least for the moment. The rapid and good adaptation of some healthcare systems prevented their capacity becoming overloaded in some countries, but not in all. And early isolation of people suspected of infection and social distancing were considered to be effective. And free access to healthcare was granted for migrants to COVID-19 treatment in many countries. Slide, please. Many governments stepped up means-tested support to bolster the incomes of those with the least resources, with new and existing job retention schemes, extensions to unemployment insurance, extensions to means-tested programs, new targeted transfers to specific groups, additional direct help with expenses, including moratorium on taxes, social contribution, and housing costs. This new support net is an example of how it is possible to ensure that social protection systems can reach all people regardless of their employment situation. Self-employed workers often had limited access to income replacement benefits or were targeted later. Insurance-based transfer tended to be less accessible to the poor. Even in countries with well-developed social protection systems, many workers who lost their income were struggling to make ends meet. In countries with large informal sectors and weak social protection systems, many affected workers did not have access to any form of income support at the beginning of the lockdown. Slide, please. Most European countries closed schools as part of their measures to limit contact between people and to slow down the spread of the virus. Positive consequences were the rapid implementation of online learning, the improved distant learning system. But digital divide related to the household's poverty, the lack of access to computer equipment and internet, inadequate and overcrowded housing, low education attainment and availability of the parents were negative aspects. Slide, please. The widening of already existing inequalities meant that those who needed most support were not receiving it and were struggling most to deal with the catastrophic economic consequences of the pandemic. These groups are older people. The pandemic sheds light on age discrimination that already existed. Older people have been systematically left behind in decisions about service allocation, medical treatment, prioritization of needs and resources. High percentages of deaths occurred in elderly care facilities, which questions the ethics of the mainstream long-term care model. Frontline and medical staff, due to the high exposition to the virus. In countries like Spain and Italy, the high degree of infections were related to the absence of the indispensable safety measures that should have preserved their health. Homeless. Existing poverty and social exclusion were decisive in the social and health impact on roofless people and those who survived in settlements or substandard houses, since they could not avoid contagion or heal in isolation in cases of contracting the disease. Homeless were a medically high-risk population, disproportionately affected by poor health and disability before, and therefore faced higher risks of dying if they contracted COVID-19. Slide, please. Atypical and self-employed workers on internet platforms in temporary jobs, the self-employed, including artists, and those who work outside the trade union coverage, who are always at risk of losing their jobs and income, were highlighted as another vulnerable group. Low-income households, because the pandemic and confinement measures had an overwhelming negative impact on already poor households, whose incomes were already inadequate, leading even to food insecurity. Children in poor families relied on schools for support and meals. They were also at a disadvantage because of lack of access to digital resources and devices, and often living in overcrowded conditions. Travelers and Roma experienced high levels of educational disadvantage, which was further reinforced through the closure of schools and dependence on distant learning, without access to any additional supports. Many had limited access to technology, lack of adequate space to study, and experienced intergenerational educational disadvantage. The closure of most business and a sharp increase in unemployment posed enlarged challenges to them compared to the wider population. Migrants and asylum seekers. This pandemic and the associated policy responses exacerbated existing structural racism and inequalities, particularly in the labor market, in housing, or in institutions such as the police, meaning that some groups are being hit harder. Slide, please. The COVID-19 virus provokes lower mortality in women than in men, but the consequences of the pandemic and the measures adopted meant an increase in gender inequality. Before the pandemic, women were already at a higher risk of poverty than men in all the surveyed countries, except for Norway. Women form the bulk of the health and social care workers, family caregivers, and low-paid workers such as cleaners. Single-parent families, majority led by women, are very vulnerable, and nearly half of them were at risk of poverty and social exclusion in the EU before the pandemics. Older women are more affected by the risk of isolation, as there are more older women living alone than men. Gender-based violence grew under lockdown or quarantine. Some groups of women face what is called intersectional inequality due to their sexuality, gender, class, race, ethnicity, and physical or mental ableness. Sexual and reproductive health rights medical follow-up in pre- and post-natal care were disproportionately impacted by the health crisis and had a long-term impact on gender inequalities and women's health, making them more vulnerable to employment precariousness, poverty, and discrimination. Slide, please. Many civil society organizations, including some EAPN members, were generally negatively affected by cuts in their funding levels, changes in their way of delivering services because of the reduction of volunteers' activities, the isolation of target populations, or the cancellation of face-to-face services. Also by changes in their ways of operation with staff layoffs, infected social workers, emotional trauma, and low morale. In some countries, NGOs were not offered protective equipment as well. Slide, please. A special section of the study is devoted to delving into the worrying increases in population control and surveillance carried out by some governments during the first months of the pandemic and the possible threats to democracy and civic freedoms. We highlight that the warlike discourse, that is, we are in a war against the virus, was very prominent in the governments in the majority of countries at the beginning of the pandemic. The liberties which were curtailed in most countries were freedom of assembly and of movement by means of the declaration of states of exception, states of alarm, states of emergency, or even martial law in the case of Serbia. Applications for personal mobiles for monitoring and tracking individuals in relation to COVID-19 involve a risk of excessive surveillance expansion. Slide. How to ensure the poor don't pay for COVID-19. Slide, please. After providing an in-depth analysis of the current situation, EAPN makes important recommendations to national and European authorities in order to leave no one behind by rebuilding a right-based Europe with a social heart and a commitment to ending poverty and reducing inequality. In the medium term, we ask for embedding poverty and social impact assessment, reinforce quality public health and social care services, prioritize adequate minimum income and social protection, protect employment, prevent precarious work, and revalue frontline work, and ensure that the poor and vulnerable groups do not pay with austerity. In the long term, we propose 8 guidelines. The first is to adopt an overarching EU social and sustainable strategy, Agenda 2030, underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals, the European Pillar of Social Rights, as a green and social recovery that makes ending poverty a prerequisite and ensures the poor benefit and do not pay for the transition. Second, agree an integrated EU anti-poverty strategy as the main goal and framework for the Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan in 2020 that reinforces integrated support to social rights to guaranteeing adequate income through quality jobs, adequate social protection and minimum income, and essential public and universal services, particularly healthcare, social care, housing, and education, with an ambitious poverty target of 50% and to ending extreme poverty, with specific targets and strategies for risk groups, for example, as the child guarantee underpinned by the 3-pillar investing in children approach, developing national strategies to tackle homelessness and housing exclusion based on housing first. Third, implement a comprehensive assessment of the impact of COVID-19 epidemic on poverty and equality in the EU, and the key groups affected and develop a clear guidance for member states to implement a transparent and effective assessment to minimize poverty, gender inequality, and guarantee equality at state level. Fourth, establish strong and balanced coordination throughout the European semester so that member states fulfill their obligation to reduce poverty and inequality, as well as to implement social rights and social cohesion and guarantee equal opportunities for all. Fifth, make progress on obligatory rights, adopt a European Framework Directive on adequate minimum income as part of the European commitment to guarantee adequate income and protect households from poverty and vulnerability, and support an EU framework on minimum and living wages. Establish mechanisms for monitoring compliance, counting on civil society organizations and EU funds. 6, ensure that the EU recovery plan benefits the poor and vulnerable, investing at least 30% of the social fund plus on social inclusion, gender equality, and the fight against discrimination. 7, ensure meaningful participation of people experiencing poverty and civil society organizations. Recognize civil society organizations as social partners at EU level, supporting the direct participation of people directly facing poverty and social exclusion. And finally, end the era of austerity in Europe and work towards a framework that prioritizes the fight against poverty and inequality, invest in human well-being, and in the preservation and protection of the natural environment that support us. Impose taxation that makes wealthier businesses and individuals help pay the costs of rescue and recovery packages. Slide, please. The pandemic is a portal. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Graciela. It's a really great piece of work, and we're thrilled to be launching it today with you. And I think, you know, the final slide you presented there is in a way partly what we're doing today is exploring how we make that better world and exploring how we continue this fight together. As you mentioned, Graciela, then the study brought together a large number of testimonies from people experiencing poverty from all over Europe. To delve in a bit more deeply into that, we've invited Sonja from EAPN Netherlands to share some further input today on that, both personal experiences as well as views on COVID-19, but also its impact on poverty in the Netherlands, Sonja, and the concerns of people experiencing poverty in the Netherlands around the impact of poverty, the impact of COVID. We've seen a number of questions which have come up in the chat box. Please keep putting your questions in, but we'll come to the end of the session with a few more speakers before coming back to those questions. So Sonja, how did you and other people experiencing poverty in your network and in the Netherlands experience COVID in recent months? And what are some of your key concerns that you'd like to share with us today? You have 10 minutes, Sonja.
Yes, thank you. Before I start, I want to say that Vera is unable to participate due to health. And I think because on behalf of all of us, I wish her all the best in this difficult period. And Vera, get well soon. And then I'm starting. I'm Sonja Limkuil from EAPN, the Netherlands. Actually, I feel like I'm rich too, since my husband and I have healthy children and grandchildren, a roof over our heads, water from the tap, central heating in the house. But at the same time, I'm financially poor in the Netherlands, and I often feel socially excluded. Poverty and social exclusion belong together. And it's paramount to be aware of the fact that you are poor in the country in which you live. Poverty means not be able to pay all fixed costs every month, and after that to have a little bit left for your groceries, clothes, shoes, uninsured medicines. On 9 July, the Dutch Authority Financial Markets admitted that one-parent families, low-income households, flex workers and working poor spend 2/3 up to 3/4 of their income on their fixed costs. You have to live on what remains for the month that's left. Poverty is to start looking at the price tag for everything you buy. Living with little money is always making choices. Every now and then healthy food or visiting your children, grandchildren, or doing something fun is really a gift. You can't always afford healthy food, fresh fruit and fresh vegetables that are good for your health. You are aware of this every day, week, month. Most you want to participate because participating costs a lot of money, and not being able to participate is feeling socially excluded. Poverty hinders active participation in society. Especially for children is poverty the reason that they cannot participating in school and with sports, music and dance. Not participating has a negative active effect on behavior, health and school performance, and increases the risk of poverty in the future. Stress and anxiety have major negative consequences for the development of children and for the well-being of adults. Not being able to participate has also another consequence. You start to become invisible for your environment, for your friends, and also for policymakers. Living in a village is in principle living in a participation society. Because I know what it is like not to be able to participate in everything, I started the Citizens Initiative, Ontmoeting onze droom, in English, Meeting Our Dream, with, by, for and from the poor and excluded citizens themselves. A place with a living room where we can be together, sharing joy and sorrows, being creative, arranging flowers, etc. Next to this, we created a repair cafe where electrical appliances and clothes can be repaired, and we created also a second-hand clothes bank. Our dream is a place where everyone can participate because we keep the costs as low as possible. Because we do everything voluntarily and none of us get paid, it is possible to pay the cost for housing. If people are short on cash, they can still participate and they are asked to contribute at the moment they have something more to spend. The great thing is that people actually do this. The respect to each other is enormous. There was already poverty even before the corona, but corona has made poverty even more visible. Many people are at home because of the corona crisis, not because they want it so badly, but because there is no other way. Around me, I also hear people say, now others can feel what we feel, what it is and how it feels not to go out, not to be able to participate in anything, and to have to stay at home all day long and live in uncertainty, day in, day out. We are experiencing this feeling for months, sometimes for years, because we can't participate in anything, because we have no money for it. Much is uncertain, and people who are physically limited or sensitive to anxiety and stress react very differently. There is a need for support, meeting each other. Due to the corona measures, we had to close our dream from March till the beginning of June. I had to stay at home for 2 months due to medical complaints, and I am still recovering. It's more my breath. The lockdown of the corona has consequences. The lockdown of poverty also has major consequences, and is lasting for years now and will for the years to come. We kept in touch with the visitors every week to avoid even more loneliness and let them know that we are thinking of them by sending them cards, calling them, and giving attention to Easter. And on my birthday, I brought them all a piece of apple pie. We also noticed that the corona measures have a huge impact on their lives. Visitors who live in a nursing home have indicated that they were not allowed to go outside. that they felt it is as something that even during the war they didn't experience. The lockdown made people feel that there was no more freedom. We hear that the number of visitors have had a very difficult time, have started drinking alcohol again, or because of the corona measures have become so self-contained because they didn't see anyone. And for fear of getting corona, they now find it very difficult to get back in touch and go outside to meet other people again. From the 1st of June, we meet again, be it from 1.5 meter distance. It's nice to see how well the visitors are feeling since we meet each other again. Board, volunteers and visitors together form a social and livable community where everyone can participate because we respect each other and where we are equal to each other. We stimulate each other and because there is enough trust that we meet again. Fortunately, visitors step by step think more positively and stand well in life again. What we continue to find very difficult is the lack of human contact, just touching each other, a palpable pat on the back or a real natural hug. With amazement, I heard Prime Minister Mark Rutte repeatedly say on television, "People, stay at home." I immediately felt the grief for all people who live on the street and have no home. In our region are quite a lot of younger homeless people. Living in poverty in corona time is difficult. The corona measures are very drastic for society and certainly also for economy with all its consequences. Fortunately, as a child, I still learned not to be in debt. First save, then buy. But how difficult is it for many who lost their jobs in a couple of months and are used as a good life and now have to live on benefits? How do they take a step back with the offer and temptation to borrow or buy on credit when it's actually not possible? All too often I see the consequences of spending more money than is possible around me. The consequences of first small and then large debts, with the enormous interest and fine amounts in the event of late repayment. Politicians, policymakers, professionals in the social domain, don't forget that you are human and that living in poverty and getting into debt can happen to anyone. Living in poverty before and after the corona period is persistently difficult for many who experience poverty and social exclusion. Many people experiencing their stress and anxiety on daily, weekly, monthly, annually basis. Living in poverty always remains difficult. You can't change the COVID-19 virus, but you can change the way you deal with it by being social together, listening to each other, and taking care of each other. The poverty virus can be changed by making different political choices and by different policies, based on trust in the people in poverty, by removing the fear and stress from people every day, week, and by treating people with confidence and by treating each other equally and with respect. This returns people's resilience, allows children to develop equally, and improves people's well-being. Nobody chooses to be poor or have no opportunities in education or in the labor markets, or let their children grow up in poverty. We need measures to reduce the cost of healthy living and public transport and to improve the residual income for living. You will understand that I'm very happy with EAPN's lobby for a decent minimum income in Europe, and that I'm pleased to see how positively the European Commission is working on this. One of the reasons for a decent minimum income and available quality healthcare is to end the fact that people in poverty have more health problems, are very often 15 years of their life sick and die 6 years earlier than people with enough money to spend. The tax on healthy vegetables and fresh fruit has increased. Why? People, including people experiencing poverty, need more fresh fruit and vegetables to stay healthy, and everyone deserves a decent life. Social participation, especially for children, is incredibly important now and in the future. Investing in children and in the families in which they grow up means to invest in a healthy society and is an investment in the economy. This corona period made poor, handicapped, excluded visible. I urge you all to stick with us so that we can stay visible always. It's time now for equal rights and equal opportunities for everyone in Europe. My last thing, Europe needs a loving social heart for everyone in Europe. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for sharing the impact of COVID on yourself, your colleagues, and your community, as well as the inspiring actions that you're taking to deal with them in the Netherlands. I think we can see from the chat box how inspiring your words have been. So thank you once again.
Okay.
We're going to move on to to hear from Commissioner Schmidt, from Mr. Schmidt, who's the Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights within the European Commission. Commissioner Schmidt, I hope you're with us and you're able to switch your video on. Hopefully we'll see you on our screen shortly. Voilà. Thank you so much for joining the session today, Commissioner. It's great to have you back with us following your participation in the European Meeting of People Experiencing Poverty last year. We hope to see you again in that meeting when we're able to organise the next one, hopefully in early 2021. Just to check, you're able to stay with us until 3:30, I believe. Is that right, for the discussion as well?
Yeah, I try to make it possible.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'd like to ask you at this stage to share your reflections on what you've just heard, to start with the study, the recommendations, the testimonies, and perhaps to outline the Commission's response to COVID, and specifically how the EU will ensure that the effective short-term responses protect the poor and hopefully lead to an EU anti-poverty strategy to end poverty in the long term, as our President Carlos said. Perhaps a focus on what the Commission will be doing to guarantee rights on adequate income and access to essential services would be most welcome. Many thanks. Over to you.
So thank you very much, dear friends. Thank you also for the very interesting and inspiring presentations I was able to listen to. I would also express my admiration for Sonia and all of you, you normally, unfortunately, by the way, do not have so many opportunities to speak up. And as Sonia told us and taught us, that it takes huge efforts and determination to come out of poverty. And I think the lessons she gave us now is extremely motivating. But it takes also heart and soul to dedicate your career and your commitment to the dignity of others. You are fighting the essence of injustice. And as it said, poverty is the sentence you get for a fault you never committed. So thank you very much for your strong dedication, and you know that I'm always supporting you. You invited me to reflect on how we can ensure that the poor do not pay for COVID-19. Sadly, we all know the short answer to this. The poor are already paying for COVID-19. And this is also what I take from the very relevant findings Graciela just presented to us. Indeed, it shows that everywhere, be it in Europe, in Brazil, or in the United States, the most vulnerable have the highest risk to be infected, and they also bear the most negative economic and social consequences of this pandemic. So in our Europe 2020 strategy, we had set a target to reduce poverty. But in 2018, still 110 million people in Europe were at risk of poverty and of social exclusion. And this figure is now increasing. In spite of government measures, not everyone has the same access to essential services, to healthcare, or to decent living conditions. People speak of U-shape or V-shape recovery. I would say that the different facets of a recovery, meaning the reaction of the financial world, of the economy, of labor markets, and of the social fabric, follow different speeds and trajectories. We know that social wounds can take a long time to heal, when they heal. And this is also a lesson of the previous crisis. I think, for example, of children who interrupted their learning and their development, of young people with few job prospects. For 30 years, the EAPN has been making proposals to fight poverty, to fight all forms of poverty and social exclusion. 30 years, according to studies, is also the difference in life expectancy that separates those with a home, and those without a home. And it was referred to just now by Sonia. 30 years, that's what the street takes away from people. And finally, that's the worst inequality in a time that sees inequalities on a sharp rise. This is why we will contribute to the combat against homelessness with an initiative at EU level. Homelessness is the most extreme form of poverty and probably the most visible. But poverty does not stop there. There is a lot more hardship we do not see, a lot more suffering we do not hear. Poverty is a multidimensional phenomenon which requires a combination of actions. And these actions need to be taken in member states, but also at regional, local, and European level. Your contribution to our action plan on the European Pillar of Social Rights, which I have read with great attention and for which I thank you wholeheartedly, highlights the different avenues that need to be pursued. You underlined the need to reinforce adequate income support for all and to improve access to key public and essential services. On public and essential services, we work with national social services. This is what we will keep on doing for the sake of good reforms. Reforms that put people at the heart of our policies. We will continue to support their development through the cohesion funds. But there are other steps we can initiate at EU level. Let me elaborate on 4 points. First, minimum wages. Today, 1 in every 10 workers get up every day to work and yet remains poor. This figure is on the rise, and at this pace we risk breaking the most fundamental promise of society, that work pays, that it brings dignity and allows social mobility. Many of the workers who helped us see through the crisis earn a low wage. Think of nurses, in many countries it's the case, supermarket workers, rubbish collectors, and so on. Some professions are calling for better pay, and they are right to do so. They did not turn their back on us when we needed them. We should not turn our backs on them now. And it's not enough to applaud them every evening. Now the moment has come to revalue these professions and to revalue their work. Ensuring adequate minimum wages is a matter of social justice and therefore a key priority for the Commission. We are currently consulting social partners on the best way to act at European level. And I intend to present our proposal later in the autumn. But besides fair wages, precarious working conditions are also a major cause of poverty. Many young so-called self-employed or on short-time contracts have experienced it, particularly during this crisis. We need more inclusive labor markets, providing quality jobs that allow people to build their lives. Another important avenue is minimum income, and it was mentioned also by the previous speakers. All people have the right to a life in dignity at all stages. This ambition is underlined in the principle of the European Pillar of Social Rights dedicated to minimum income, and we need to keep it as our baby. Minimum income schemes exist in all member states, but their design and implementation vary significantly and create real challenges. First, schemes need to set the right amount of minimum income in order to cover living expenses. Currently, the minimum income is higher than the poverty threshold only in 2 member states. Second, eligibility criteria and administrative processes need to be simple and ensure that minimum income remains accessible. Frequently, the people in need may not even know their rights or may face burdensome conditions. And third, these schemes must enable active inclusion in the labor market for those who can work, because dignity also comes with work. I have taken due note of your contribution and proposals, and I'm now looking forward to follow closely the work of the Council that the German presidency has started and taken the commitment to put minimum income on our agenda. My third point is child poverty. The UNICEF estimated that COVID-19 could throw an additional 106 million children into poverty. That is a chilling figure, but there is more. The greatest increases would be for children of Central Asia and Europe. This is not a fact of life we have to accept. Every child must have the right to grow healthy and happy and with the opportunities to become a fulfilled adult. But it's more than just an individual right. It's about the future of our societies. Do we accept the vicious circle of poverty, barring the future to so many children, and by that we lose their talents, their capacities, and we destroy finally their opportunities? This will be the purpose of the European Child Guarantee, that every child has access to education, healthcare, as well as adequate housing and nutrition. The Commission intends to put forward its proposal early next year. To achieve this, we propose that for the first time, at least 5% of the future ESF Plus resources of member states are dedicated to reduce child poverty in the next 7 years. And I must say, I count on you to speak up for maintaining this important threshold. Let me now come to energy poverty. Tell 400 million Europeans that lighting and warming your flat can be a struggle, and they may not understand why. But the remaining 40 million knows too well what that means. Their income support could help. The Commission will also launch a massive housing renovation wave program across the continent. Poor and unsafe housing increases energy bills and health expenses and affects the poorer persons and families disproportionately. This is what the great writer James Baldwin meant when he said that anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how expensive it is to be poor. At the same time, such a policy of renovation could not only reduce CO2 emissions, but certainly help create hundreds of thousands of good jobs, particularly in SMEs. On this note, I welcome the involvement of the EAPN in energy projects, but also in the Right to Energy Coalition. Together we can pursue an objective that no one ever has to choose between food and heating. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I have outlined a few areas of our work, and nothing will be possible without adequate funding. In the midst of the crisis, European funding came to the rescue of families. To ensure that this response remains available in the coming years, we also proposed 55 billion a fresh funding until 2022, which can be allocated to the European Social Fund and the European aid to the most deprived. You also know that many young people risk becoming poor. A couple of weeks ago, we unveiled new plans to support youth employment and training with at least 22 billion euros. We also have to view social policies in a different way. They are major investments on which depends the future of our societies, be it health, education, social protection. Therefore, it is the right moment to relaunch social investments. I have mentioned that nothing will be possible without funding. Let me also stress that nothing will be possible either without international cooperation. It is why the EU set aside 36 billion to help international partners fight the consequences of the COVID-19. I warmly welcome the presence today of UN Special Rapporteur, Mr. De Scutter. We are looking forward to the publication and presentation of your thematic report on just transition at the UN General Assembly. Allow me to reiterate our unwavering support to your work. Let me now conclude, recalling that exactly 9 months ago, the Nobel Prize of Economy was awarded to MIT researchers, among them Esther Duflo, for their innovative approaches to alleviate poverty, based on a better practical understanding of the poverty mechanisms. In 2015, another economist, Andrew Dayton, received the same award for his analysis of consumption, inequalities, and welfare. So poverty was more in the focus in the last 5 years than in the previous decades. And if I'm telling you this, it's because I believe we have a momentum. The issue is on the agenda, and we know better how to fight it. The time may be ripe to put an end in Europe to this great scourge. The present crisis, in that sense, represents at the same time new major risks, because we have seen that poverty increases, but also new opportunities if we seize them. We would owe it to you, the European Anti-Poverty Network. And we would also owe it to individuals like Muhammad Yunus, the inventor of microcredits, who showed that poverty is not a fatality, and that particularly women are major actors to get out of poverty. Muhammad Yunus said that the proper place of poverty is in museums. This to me is a powerful drive. So I offer you this, that together, we keep working together so poverty becomes part of our history museums. The earlier, the better. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Commissioner. We know that your time is perhaps slightly limited, so we might just take a quick opportunity just to invite one question, because there have been lots coming in on the chat, and I don't think we're going to have time for all of them before you'll need to leave. So we have a question coming in from Caroline from the Belgian Anti-Poverty Network. So Caroline, perhaps you could stick your video on, and Rebecca can unmute you. So we'll take this one question for you, Commissioner Schmidt, if that's okay, before passing on to Olivier De Schutter. Caroline?
Thanks, Leo. I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. We had a question for Commissioner Schmidt, because for over the last decades, EAPN and its members have been asking for adequate, accessible and enabling minimum income schemes. The crisis has hit financial vulnerable households the hardest in Belgium and in many other EU member states, because, for instance, of loss of income, higher costs for food, basic goods, healthcare, and so on. And it's clear that more than ever, we need structural measures to combat poverty, such as guaranteeing a decent minimum income for all. And that's why I wanted to ask the Commissioner whether the Commission will propose an EU framework directive for minimum income to guarantee that all member states provide minimum income to everybody at adequate levels in the action plan of the European Pillar of Social Rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Commissioner, I hope you heard the question okay. I know the sound cut very briefly.
In a way, I responded already in my speech to this question. Certainly, we will start working on a European framework for minimum income. So I said that this work will start now under German presidency, because the German presidency has announced that they want to put that on the agenda of the EPSCO Council, and also adopt council conclusions. And from there on, we will certainly work on this framework in order to guarantee in all the member states that minimum income, which more or less exists in the 27 member states, but as I said, at a very varied and differentiated level, and very often, finally, they do not really take out people out of poverty. And the objective, finally, of minimum income is to take people out of poverty and to guarantee to them a decent living. And that's what we aim at. And this will be part of this framework we will start working on. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks for the clarification. At this stage, I think then we'll move on to hear from Olivier de Schutter, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Olivier, you have a long history of working to combat poverty at the European and the international levels, and your new role is absolutely crucial. I think maybe especially given the recent damning report of your predecessor, which was just launched a few days ago, and his warnings of the impact of COVID-19 on poverty and the inadequacy of our systems to deal with it. So many thanks for being with us today. How would you respond, Olivier, to the study and to the recommendations? And what do you feel is necessary at the European level in both the short and longer term to cope with COVID and to meaningfully tackle poverty in line with SDG 1? I think we'd especially welcome your thoughts on European frameworks to enforce social rights as well. And as I said, maybe in the framework of your report that was presented to the Human Rights Council last week as well.
Thank you, Leo, and many thanks to all those who took the floor before me. I particularly welcome the very encouraging remarks by Commissioner Nicolas Schmit, but also the testimony from Sonia and the introductory remarks from Carlos. I think the presentation by Graziella of the study was extremely interesting. It highlights the challenges we face as we now wish to build on the reactions that member states have had in reaction to the COVID-19 crisis to really move social protection forward in the EU. As Commissioner Schmit emphasized, the right to social protection is not simply a human right protected under international human rights law, and particularly Article 9 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It is also an excellent investment in the future. It is an investment in the future because it can cushion the impacts of an economic crisis and have a contra-cyclical effect, if you wish, allowing a speedy economic recovery. It's an investment because it provides businesses, especially SMEs, an incentive to hire workers despite uncertainties in the future. And I refer in particular to the temporary employment schemes that were put up by a number of member states following the example of Germany. And it is an investment in the future because, of course, it allows to strengthen human capital and to ensure that people build qualifications in order to plan the future. And I think it's really important that we learn from the lessons of 2008 to 2009, and that we see this crisis as an encouragement to build far more resilient social protection systems. But the presentation by Graziella and the study of EAPN has emphasized a number of challenges we face. And perhaps the first and the most important one in this context is the gap between the rights that are proclaimed on paper and that are in principle invocable by individuals, and the ability for people to take up these rights. And indeed, the problem of non-take-up of rights is one that is highlighted by the study by EAPN, and indeed by the very moving testimony from Sonia. People may have rights they never claim because they are poorly informed, because they are shameful, or ashamed to claim them, because they fear contacts with social services, for example, because they are undocumented migrants or families in poverty who fear that the child may be removed from the family if the child is considered to be at risk. People may not have the documentation required. They may not have an address they can provide if they are homeless people. They may fear the conditionalities associated with social aid or unemployment benefits, and they may simply have other priorities to pursue because they are facing the urgent need to find solutions for the next day. And so for all these reasons, the rates of non-take-up of rights remain extremely high in the EU as in other states, in other regions, and that is certainly one reason why the participation of people experiencing poverty and of civil society groups is important in designing social protection schemes and in monitoring how they are implemented. If people in poverty are not able to participate in assessing these programs and designing them, inevitably there will be cracks in the system. People will fall between these cracks, and thus the people most at risk of poverty may not be able to be adequately supported. This is indeed what the work of ATD Fourth World on the hidden dimensions of poverty has also highlighted. This work is important because it shows that poverty goes beyond a lack of income. It's also about shame, it's about stress, anguish, it's about disempowerment, it's about social and institutional abuse and neglect. And so it's extremely important that this experience of people in poverty is built upon in order to build social protection schemes that go beyond guaranteeing rights in theory, but effectively protect people in practice. My second remark is that the move towards strengthening social protection must be inclusive of people in all situations of life. And I welcome in particular the very powerful remarks of Commissioner Schmidt concerning the informal sector and people in precarious forms of employment. We should never forget that in Europe today, 4 out of 10 workers in the EU are in non-standard forms of employment or are self-employed. And these people very often have a weak access or no access to social protection. And this is one of the reasons why 1 in 10 Europeans in work are actually facing in-work poverty, as again reiterated by Commissioner Schmidt. And so I believe it's extremely important to have the Council recommendation of November 2019 on access to social protection for workers and the self-employed adopted. This implements the principle number 12 of the European Pillar of Social Rights that states that regardless of the type and duration of their employment relationships, workers and under comparable conditions, the self-employed have the right to adequate social protection. I think it's extremely important that this recommendation is followed up and that in the reconstruction following the crisis, we seek inspiration in this recommendation. Thirdly, I think it's fair to say that in the past years, the EU has not always sent the right signals to member states, and a number of pressures have been exercised on the member states to actually become competitive states that may be encouraged in some cases to reduce the burden on employers, on companies, shift that burden on households in order to be competitive in the internal market and to attract investment. Some states also have been fearing to attract migrants as a result of being too generous in their social protection schemes. And indeed, the Pact for Stability and Growth associated with the Economic and Monetary Union has led many member states to adopt very strict conditions for access to social advantages, to associate conditionalities with social benefits. The activation of these social benefits has been a trend we've seen since the past 20 years. And so it's very important that today the Commission takes seriously the need to rebalance European integration towards strengthening social rights in order to ensure that we not only have a competitive economy, but also an economy that protects people from being at risk of poverty or social exclusion. In this regard, I see three key priorities. The first one is to build inclusive labor markets. And again, Commissioner Schmidt did mention this idea. We need to take seriously the idea that all people, all individuals have qualifications that the markets should recognize, and that we have enough work for all, although we do not necessarily have enough employment that is paid for by the market for all people who are qualified. And I follow very closely the experiences in France, for example, around the territoires zéro chômeur de longue durée, regions that pledge to eradicate long-term unemployment by providing with each individual a possibility to have his or her qualifications recognized and investing in the people so that they can show how they can provide services to the community. And we have no time to dwell much on this, but I really think labor markets could be made much more inclusive by recognizing these people's qualifications, although they may not be formalized in a diploma. The second key idea is indeed fair minimum wages across Europe. And as we know, the European Commission has taken a very important initiative on this, and now entering the second phase consultation to ensure harmonized criteria for fair minimum wages across Europe. I believe these fair minimum wages should build on the living wage concept that is part of the corpus of international human rights law and discussed in particular in the General Comment number 23 adopted in 2016 by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. This idea is that the minimum wage should be set in accordance with the requirements of a decent living and should be regularly revised with the social partners in order to take into account the increased cost of living and, for example, expenses linked to housing, to education, or to healthcare. The third key priority is indeed the campaign for a framework directive on minimum income to ensure a consistent approach towards minimum income across the EU, building on the very important 1992 Council recommendation on this same issue. And then fourth and finally, I would say that beyond protecting people from the risk of poverty, including people in precarious employment and in the informal sector of the economy, we need to ensure that the financing of social protection is equitable. And this corresponds to what was adopted by a large range of partners who launched this call for action in 2019 under the umbrella of the Partnership for Universal Social Protection 2030, emphasizing that not only people should be protected from poverty by strengthened social protection, but also that the financing should be equitable. In other terms, it should be based not on an increase of VAT rates, not on increased taxation of households, but on progressive taxation schemes and increased taxes on the largest corporations. And so I think it's very important that we look also at this question of who shall pay for the economic recovery and how shall, in the future, social protection be financed in a way that should be not only sustainable, but also equitable. And so I would like to, again, thank EAPN for this very important study that I believe shall be a source of inspiration in the next few years. I very much look forward to contributing to this work in the future, and I would like to thank all participants for their contributions to this important discussion. Many thanks, and I look forward to the rest of this panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Olivier, for raising some key questions at the end, especially around the question of financing around social protection as well. There's an interesting paper some colleagues from EAPN wrote a couple of years ago on that, so maybe we can share that with participants after this. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna bring in two colleagues who had a couple of quick questions directed at Commissioner Schmidt, who I know needs to leave in 5 minutes. So Commissioner, maybe you'll be able to have a minute or two to respond to those, and then we'll have time for another couple, perhaps after the Commissioner has to leave us. So we had, maybe we'll hear the two questions from Paula Cruz from the Portuguese Anti-Poverty Network, as well as Freek from Fianza as well. So maybe we'll start with Paula, then Freek, you could come in as well, and then we'll pass back to the Commissioner, who then I think would need to leave after that.
Thank you, Leo. I hope you are listening. Thank you, Mr. Schmidt, for your contribution. We have listened for a while that it's time for the European Union to have a strategy to fight poverty. What proposal the Commission will make that ensures that all member states develop integrated rights-based strategies, guaranteeing adequate income, quality jobs, minimum income, social protection, and access to essential and public services. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paula. And then Freek, I believe there was a question you had around the homelessness strategy, which the Commissioner had highlighted.
Yes, thank you, Leo. Do you hear me? Yes, okay. Thanks a lot. I had two questions, one technical question and one political question, but I'll just ask the political question, which was indeed about homelessness. So thanks for confirming again that the European Commission will take a significant initiative on homelessness. I was just interested, do you personally believe that homelessness can be ended by 2030 as is actually in the SDGs, the UN SDGs? And what do you think the European Union can do to promote progress towards that goal? Thank you.
Okay, so Commissioner, in the last few minutes you have with us, if you have any thoughts on those two questions around a poverty strategy and ending homelessness in the next 10 years.
Well, I think that all the member states have committed themselves to implement the Pillar of Social Rights, and the Pillar of Social Rights is covering all these issues which were discussed and mentioned. And which are very much the response to a more equal, fairer, inclusive society, and where poverty is eradicated, and where every individual has better opportunities. So I think we still have to work on that with very concrete proposals. Minimum income was mentioned, different labor market policies is another aspect, about precariousness. All this is a patchwork of a lot of measures. But we will have next year on the Portuguese presidency a very important meeting, a summit where we will present this action plan on the implementation of the social pillar. And here member states and their governments have to take clear positions. So I think the Commission has no possibility to automatically enforce all measures, but we can really create the indispensable incentives. Now, on the homelessness, I think this is also a question of political priority. 2030, that's 10 years. I think we can, if we cannot eventually eradicate, we can at least, or we have to. It's not just a question of being able or not. We have to reduce very dramatically the number of homeless people. That's a question of social policy. That's a question of creating also the necessary housing facilities. So I think if with the support of Europe, and now we will have a lot, hopefully, a lot of money of the recovery. And I think to say, okay, a small portion of this money has to go into housing, affordable housing, also housing for people who have to be supported, like the homeless people, because you have to build around them also the social services. Then I think the objective, the target by 2030 is envisageable. That's a question of political priority, of political will, and I think we have to mobilize our societies to go absolutely in this direction. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks for the responses, Commissioner. If you need to leave now, we'll understand. We're going to take a couple of more questions. I saw there were two questions. First of all, from Ides Nisais, sorry if I'm mispronouncing. And then there was a question from Catherine Duffy in the UK as well. So Ides, first of all, and then Catherine, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It was a wonderful session, and I'm excited to hear from Commissioner Schmidt that he finds it necessary to revamp social investment policies, because that term was like disappearing in the past 5 years from the policy agenda in Europe. I think minimum income in particular is also a form of social investment, in the sense that we should not forget that households themselves are continuously investing. They are investing in their children, in decent education, in mobility, in decent housing, in decent nutrition, etc. And minimum income has also that function of allowing households in periods of hardship to continue investing in their own future and in the future of their families. And for that reason, we need to have decent levels of minimum income, not just minimum income levels that allow people to survive. I refer to a research that we are currently conducting called Reinvest. We had it at the European level and also at the Belgian level. And the aim is to demonstrate that decent levels of social protection allow people indeed to exit from poverty in a sustainable way. This is the opposite of many policies that were conducted in the past, where which were built on the paradigm of making work pay, and that involved a principle that you should exert pressure on people and that you should make them starve in order to motivate them to work. And this apparently has not worked in the past. It's also scientifically disregarded. It is proven falsified. So I hope that for the future we will build our social protection policies on decent theories. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the comment and the question. Catherine, you had a question as well, I believe. If you'd like to unmute and video.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Thanks. I had a bit of a family emergency, so I haven't been keeping up. So I hope I'm not out of sync. I thought the words spoken have been very fine, but in the UK we're getting rather used to performative politics where the action and the implementation doesn't follow. And I hope that's not going to be the case here and this time, because we've had two crises of our system, our Western systems and everybody's in the last 10 years. They're clearly not resilient. The financial crisis is now this even worse one. And yet I can already hear, despite the temporary measures, the siren call of austerity again, in which the poor will definitely pay, not only by having been more at risk of COVID, but more at risk from some of the policies which have rather ignored certain groups. There's not been a lot for children yet, for example. So that's my question. Are we going to see a shift this time, or are we going for our third crisis in this system? Apologies for being a bit out of sync.
No problem. Thank you, Catherine. Olivier, perhaps Olivier or Graciela or Sonia, would either of you like to come back on these 2 points? The point about social protection systems that are enabling a more sustainable long-term way out of poverty, or Catherine's question as to, are we actually going to see systematic change this time, recognizing the fact that our systems simply aren't fit for purpose, and the second crisis is demonstrating this, the second in 10 years. Who would like to come back on this?
I think we all agree. That's the problem. We're talking to ourselves.
May I?
Graciela, please.
Yes, I think that Commissioner Smith said something very important. There is a new momentum, and we need to take advantage of it. It's not any year or any month. It's after the biggest pandemic that we suffered in Europe in recent years. So it's. I think that we need to take advantage of this opportunity and push even harder. And it seems that civil society has changed in the appreciation of the importance of healthcare, of education, of investing in social protection. At least this is something that came up in the survey very clearly, that a big portion of the societies are now more involved in protecting what they already have and promoting healthcare, for example.
Thanks, Graciela. Olivier, would you like to come back with a final word, maybe, for this session?
Sure. Thank you, Leo. I would like to thank Edith Niquez and Catherine Duffy for their questions. I think it's important to realize that we should move beyond the debate of 2008-2009, when there was a discussion between those who believed we needed to put order in public budgets and move to reducing public deficits as fast as possible in order to reassure the markets, which led to the austerity plans being adopted in the countries that were most at risk of seeing the cost of borrowing money on the markets rise, and those who instead insisted on the need to have a social recovery, investing in people and allowing a demand-driven growth to develop. We must move beyond this debate, and the reason for this is that the Commission has adopted the Green Deal in December 2019 as its flagship initiative, which calls for a very different understanding of what growth should be about. And I believe that we all should today ask ourselves, how can the fight against poverty and the reduction of inequalities be made not only compatible, but an essential ingredient in this idea of a sustainable, i.e. green recovery. And in this regard, I would like to make two remarks, because they really, it seems to me, should be at the heart of the economic recovery as shaped by the Green Deal, but as using the reduction of poverty and the reduction of inequalities as an ingredient. First of all, it's important to note that in more equal societies, you need much less growth in order to reduce poverty. Simply because if you create wealth, it will benefit the poorest segments of the population. If you put the redistribution of wealth, the fight against inequalities, at the heart of the macroeconomic and fiscal policies. So there's in other terms, an essential ingredient of green growth is actually to have a reduction of inequalities. And secondly, the ecological transition that is at the heart of the Green Deal project can benefit people in poverty by two channels. First, by the employment creation it can lead to, for example, in renewable energies, in the circular economy, or in the retrofitting of buildings. And secondly, because investments that are made in the name of the ecological transition can improve access of low-income households and people in poverty to goods and services that are essential for the enjoyment of human rights. For example, access to public transport, access to better insulated buildings that can allow the energy bills to be reduced. And so there are many convergences here. And in my view, what we really should try to look at is how the fight against poverty and the reduction of inequalities can contribute to this agenda. And that's the only way we can move beyond this debate between austerity versus demand-driven growth as usual, if you wish.
Okay, thank you, Olivier, for the response there. This is going to bring us to the close of the first session. So I'd like to offer a big virtual thanks as best we can, and a round of applause to all of our panelists and our speakers. The report that Graciela presented and authored is available on the website. The link has been shared in the chat box, but we'll also share the details directly and via mail as well. If you haven't registered for the meeting today, please do put your email address into the chat box and we'll add you to the list for the mailing afterwards as well then. So as I said, we'll move on to session 2 now, where we'll hear from other European and national level decision makers and key stakeholders about how we can move from short-term COVID measures to long-term solutions to tackling poverty and social exclusion. Again, we've got a great panel coming up with Herbert Duhl from the German government. And as you'll know, Germany has just assumed the presidency of the European Council just last week. We have Esther Lynch from the European Trade Union Confederation. We have Jenna Haynesworth, the General Secretary of Eurochild, who's a key member of the European Anti-Poverty Network and the leader of the Investing in Children Alliance, as well as MEP Cindy Franson from EPP, who's also the co-chair of the European Parliament's Intergroup on the Fight Against Poverty. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers again just after the presentation. So please do type your questions into the chat box. Again, apologies to those of you who may have posed questions and didn't have time to be brought in. So on this point, we'll bring in Mr. Herbert Duhl, who's the head of division on the project group on economic aspects of European social affairs within the Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs within the German government. Perhaps, Mr. Duhl, perhaps you could talk to us about the contribution of the German presidency to preventing and reducing poverty during and after the COVID-19 pandemic and getting upward convergence on social rights. Maybe you could tell us what the presidency is planning on adequate income and other measures to combat poverty. You have 5 minutes. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate all the contributions of the first round, so I can build on. And I just want to explain in a broader context what the German presidency want to achieve in this area, and then I will go to this already mentioned initiative. We are planning council conclusions on minimum income protection. And so I start with the context and the narrative we have during the presidency. In the broader context, we will work on common EU responses to the pandemic by putting a focus on strengthening the EU's economic base as well as the social dimension. And I think the Graciela and others already said the crisis has revealed the need for joint action in this case, and the dimension of financing already was mentioned. So for us, the multi-annual financial framework will set the foundation for necessary further steps, especially for the recovery. But doubtless, social issues have become even more important as we need to mitigate the social and employment consequences of the crisis. And so in my ministry, we are working for some months and years now in preparation of the presidency. So I'm happy to present you this small hashtag, My Social Europe, and explain you to the audience what we want to achieve. And I also, this is a little bit of advertising note, I want to to introduce to the audience that we have a thematic reader. You can find all the narratives and arguments we have, and have a lot of contributions there in this rationale. So I can refer to a published conversation between my state secretary Rolf Schmachtenbeck and Professor Frank Vandenbrücke, well known in this area. They make the case for a union of strong and effective welfare states in the wake of the corona pandemic and beyond. And so I already know this is not very inventive. We know there is a little bit of a momentum now to have a discussion how to ensure that the recovery will also include the people on the lower scale of income. But this is going to a long-standing demand. So the EAPN, well known for this long-standing stance for a binding European framework. And we work on this and find it that this is good to discuss it now. Even more, we know this approach finds some public support among the European citizens. You will find in our thematic reader a short contribution by Sharon Borty of University of Amsterdam. She presents some interesting empirical evidence for and why Europeans take a positive stance towards the EU efforts to improve the adequacy of minimum incomes. So the question, what is the case for the national level or for the EU level? I think we have to face that there is a need for a European framework in the area of minimum income protection, which could also contribute to the creation of an individual ownership of EU citizens for the EU social dimension. And we want to address and involve the European civil society, for instance, when we organize now a major conference on social Europe in September, also with the participation of the civil society, in particular of the European Anti-Poverty Network. So we all know with a framework for minimum income protection, we would have the ambition to protect people from social exclusion everywhere in the EU. And we already heard from the Commissioner that the minimum income protection systems are very different and variant in the EU. But the goal we would have is not harmonization of the systems. It would be the idea to promote certain minimum standards. And these minimum standards are in the areas of proper access to minimum income protection, of the question of adequacy, and all the enabling aspects you mentioned for inclusive labor markets. And I'm not very inventive to say this is all well known and developed also by the work by the European Anti-Poverty Network in terms of principles and practical guidelines. And so we decided to introduce a draft of council conclusions at the beginning of this month, and I'm happy to have the first round of a working party the day after tomorrow to discuss with the member states about this draft. And this draft and these possible conclusions will address the various bodies both on the respective national level and on the EU level. The member states, the Commission, the Social Protection Committee. And at the heart of this, our proposal for Council recommendations calls on the Commission to present a legal act in the near future. And I was very happy to hear that Commissioner Schmidt has announced that they will work on this framework in this context, and probably we will have this during the presidency of our Portuguese colleagues. So for now, such a proposal builds on the ongoing Commission activities, in particular on the benchmarking in the area of minimum income. And we were happy to introduce these conclusions, but to be honest, at this stage, we are not ready to seek an agreement on the questions you will put on me. Will this be a framework with a legally binding directive or a non-binding recommendations? So this is, in our point of view, part of the process. So for the first stage, we will begin these discussions with the member states and to address to the Commission that there is need for action and also need for action for the member states in this regard. And we will do our conversations with the member states, and hopefully we will find a clear majority that there will be need of actions in this regard. And I think this will be lay the foundations for a proper discussion with the civil society and also with the member states in the near future. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Mr. Zul, for clarifying where we stand in terms of the conclusions, the minimum income debate, etc. And we hear your message clearly that it's not the time to kind of ask for further clarifications around the specificities of legal frameworks, etc. at this stage.
I'm happy to discuss every detail of a possible directive, but for the German presidency, we are not in the position to make such a proposal. It's the case for the Commission, and we are in this stage to have a good discussion in this way. And we think we have a momentum, like Commissioner Schmidt already said.
Okay, understood. Thank you. I'm going to bring in Esther Lynch now, who's the Deputy General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. In a way, we're going to move slightly from talking about minimum income to minimum wage, I suspect. Esther, maybe you could talk to us a little about the ETUC priorities for action to prevent an increase in poverty as a result of COVID-19 and to close the inequality gap. What's the key concerns ETUC has at the moment on income, jobs, and post-COVID? Again, you have 5 minutes, please. Over to you.
So thank you, Leo, and I want to thank the EAPN and all of your affiliates for all of the work that you do to assist all of those workers, the 20,000 workers who, despite having a job, still can't make ends meet. I know that they come to you for help, for food, for housing, to be able to live a life of dignity. And I want to begin by saying that. So to thank you very much for all of that work that you do for those workers. I think there are 4 opportunities that we should seize now. And we should bear in mind, I thought Catherine Duffy's point was excellent, is how can we trust any of this? And I think we should keep it high in our minds. I think there are 4 major initiatives that certainly for the EAPN and the trade unions that we should try and make the most of, but we should do it in a determined way and in a way that is hugely hopeful but not naive. Hugely hopeful but not naive. I think that needs to be the approach of all of us in the next 6 months. So by being hugely hopeful, the trade union movement is currently discussing our reply to the 2nd stage consultation on minimum wages. And what that means is that the Commission has asked us, what can the EU do about improving minimum wages? So we're currently voting on what our position will be, but I would like to share with you on that basis what we're thinking about. Like yourselves, you can't look to the recent past and necessarily think that the EU is always going to do the right thing about minimum wages. In fact, if you look to the recent past, the EU did the exact wrong thing about minimum wages between encouraging or enforcing member states to push minimum wages downwards. So we want to take the approach in this initiative of guaranteeing that in the future, the EU takes a responsible approach towards minimum wages. And that means guaranteeing a threshold below which no minimum wage, statutory minimum wage in Europe should fall. And we believe that threshold should be 50% of the average and 60% of the median. It needs to be both. It can't be either or. It needs to be both because inequality works differently in different member states. So in some member states, 60% is higher, and in some member states, 50% of the average is higher than 60% of the median. So we need this combined target, because you and I know if we have an either or situation, employers will do nothing other than drag trade unions and poor people through the courts to say we can't have that minimum wage because it should be this one and not this one. So we need this threshold of decency to guarantee a threshold below which minimum wages shouldn't go. That does not mean that we're saying that's what minimum wages should be. We're saying that is the guarantee below which no minimum wage should go, and instead there needs to be a proper dialogue with workers, with trade unions in the member state to say, is that adequate? Is that amount adequate? So, and then minimum wages need to be set above that threshold. But to be certain that we're not being, if you like, taken into a discussion that could actually be a straitjacket that holds minimum wages down, we want to see that threshold of decency. And then the discussion can be on, is that adequate after that? But without that threshold of decency, we're worried about what we're being presented with. Because if it's a set of criteria put in the wrong hands, our experience is a set of criteria without a threshold of decency could actually end up holding minimum wages back or dragging them downwards. So we're being very clear about that threshold being an absolute essential item that has to be very visible and guaranteed. The second thing we're saying about minimum wages is exactly as came out in the report, and Graciela, I want to congratulate you on that report. I'll make sure, and with my colleague Lena Carr here, we'll make sure that this gets into the hands of trade unions too. So I'm looking forward to circulate that. What we see is that there's 101 ways in which a very small minimum wage employers find ways of taking it from people. So they'll have all sorts of deductions, whether it's for your uniform, whether it's because you've dropped something on the floor or because you were 5 minutes late. There's lots of ways in which employers make unfair deductions for minimum wages, and we want that stopped. We have on top of that all of the hours of work that people are directly or indirectly required to do for which they're not paid. That has to be stamped out. And likewise, all of those workers, often the most vulnerable, most exploited workers who are excluded from the right to the minimum wage, they have to be included. So that's what we see as being realistic and achievable, and we really hope that the EAPN will work with us towards achieving that outcome from this discussion. We have other important demands too, which is about making sure, because you and I know, like everybody who works in this area or has lived through poverty, has experienced it, knows that the way in which you get empowered is by sticking with your mates. It's by working together. It's by making sure that people can properly bargain in a trade union for their fair pay. And we also know that often it's the workers who most need trade unions who are denied them, who are frightened to be able to join a union, and who are prevented from doing so by their employer, and that practice has to stop. The European Union can't on the one hand say we want to promote social dialogue and turn a blind eye to the amount of union busting that's going on, the like of which you would never have thought you would have seen in Europe, but now which is taking hold in many states. Then the second opportunity we have is the Pay Transparency Directive. Now, the Pay Transparency Directive is going to be published, we hope, in November. And what we've been saying to Commissioner Dalli is that she needs to make sure that part of that is a re-evaluation of the work that's predominantly done by women. There is no moral or legal or economic justification of why cleaners are paid so little. Same for retail workers, all of whom have, during this crisis, put themselves on the line every single day by turning up at work, doing a good day's work, keeping people safe, and we need to reevaluate across a whole sector the value of those jobs. And that directive could do it if it put the tools into the hands of those workers to be able to do a sector-wide re-evaluation of jobs that are predominantly done by women. It's not enough that we take care of women at the top. We have to take care of all women working in Europe, and that's the way we could do that, through a good job evaluation tool. The third opportunity is this minimum income discussion. And I think that this is a really important discussion that then we're going to need an awful lot of cooperation with the EAPN on, to make sure that we've not got one set of poor people, for example, working poor people, put against another set of poor people, namely those without jobs. And we all too often, the divide and conquer strategies are trying to be developed between us. So you say, well, if somebody has to go to work and they have to work on this amount of money, then this person has to get less money in it. And it's like a horrible little race to the bottom that we have to put. We have to make sure that that doesn't happen to us in this discussion. We can't have it being presented of, well, you can have minimum income or you can have minimum wage or anything like that. We have to be very clear that very often people on minimum wage still need an minimum income strategy because of their family circumstances, because of the price of housing, or because there's a disability in the family, or because they need help with other family circumstances. So we need to be very clear that there is not, say, a straight line between that. But we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful that employers don't see that the way in which we get a fair minimum wage is by paying, by carrying on paying this same small amount of money, and instead look to the state to pick up the slack through minimum income. So we have to be very careful of that not being a strategy used against us. And then I know I'm over time now, so just one final point then. We also need to end the exploitation because of low hours, 0 hours, work arrangements, and then also the practice whereby people are even denied the respect of being an employee, that is pretended that you're a self-employed worker who has to cutthroat compete with the worker that you're sitting beside because of the claim that you're a self-employed person. So so a lot to play for, but again, hopeful, realistic, determined action, I think, can achieve all of those can achieve those improvements through those 4 initiatives. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Esther. I think for me, the key takeaway I have from that is that you're stronger with your mates. So we're very thrilled to be working at the European and national level with you and your members as well, between the EAPN members at the national level and the ETUC members as well. I think it's that way that we're going to win these things. We're going to move on to hear from Jenna Haynesworth, the General Secretary of Eurochild now. Jenna, we know that children have been hit hard by COVID. Maybe you could talk to us about both Eurochild and the Investing in Children Alliance's concerns regarding child and family poverty and children's rights, particularly in the frame of the implementation plan, which we heard about before, of the Pillar of Social Rights, pressing for a broader approach to delivering on poverty and well-being. What else is needed? You've got 5 minutes as well. Thanks, Jenna.
Thank you very much, Leo, and I'll follow on from many of my predecessors in congratulating the EAPN for today's conference, and also the report that you're launching today and its recommendations. I very much appreciate the ambition of the report. I appreciate the links to the thinkers of this being the occasion to break through some of the walls that we have faced in previous decades. And I would be in the camp that sees the alignment of many opportunities at this moment in time to be doing things very differently in the future and not going back to the previous normal. I think that's underpinned by the scale of the crisis. I think that's underpinned by something Sonia referred to in her intervention, in that the experience of COVID-19 touches upon a very common humanity between us all, and that creates an openness to investment in all of the services that we depend on, and the fact that our societies are not sustainable with the levels of inequality that exist. And I think we have a momentum with the extraordinary allies at EU level, having heard from Commissioner Schmidt, but also now with the German presidency taking over, the commitments that they have, and upcoming Portuguese presidency. So I really believe that we have a momentum that we should not lose of this opportunity. That said, of course, it's no time for complacency. And my biggest fear is, as we all sit here today, that we do not need to convince each other, that we are the convinced. And so how do we together make what needs to happen by speaking to those who are not necessarily convinced? And I'm very much aware that we at EU level, we have a very privileged space as civil society representatives, and that is not mirrored at national level. And how we can strengthen our respective national member organisations, build those alliances, and ensure that national governments are held to account with the voices of civil society needs to be where our time and energy is vested as we move into the next year with these extraordinary opportunities in front of us. Of course, I will be speaking to the area of children's rights and child poverty, and we are very excited by the commitment of this European Commission to develop the Child Guarantee Initiative, something that we've been advocating for decades, to fight child poverty. And it's not an accident that the 2013 recommendation on investing in children is called Breaking the Cycle of Poverty. Because as Nicola Schmidt highlighted, investing in children is not for children's sake only. It is for society as a whole. And that if we can address poverty in childhood, we will be able to create new generations where poverty will, in fact, be made history. We know that throughout the crisis, as across all sectors, those who were most vulnerable before are most strongly hit by the current crisis. But now we have the opportunity that child poverty is on the EU radar, that there's a commitment that the Child Guarantee will follow the three-pillar approach of the Investing in Children recommendation, which is fundamental to the demands of Eurochild and the broader Alliance on Investing in Children, which EAPN is a part alongside many other networks. Firstly, it's a commitment to ensure all families, all households have access to adequate resources, and a lot has already been said around that with respect to minimum income, wage policy. The second pillar is the access to services, absolutely crucial for children in relation to the 5 areas particularly that have been identified under the Child Guarantee. We're talking about housing, healthcare, education, childcare, and nutrition. We in Eurochild would also be talking much more about family supports and how, oh, that was my 5 minutes, so I will be very quick. The third pillar of the Investing in Children recommendation is the one that is most close to the Eurochild's heart, which is the fact that children have the right to be involved in decision making. And I know as EAPN, you are living testament to the importance of voice and ensuring people experiencing poverty have voice in decisions. And we want to extend that to children and believe that that starts early, that commitment to ensuring everybody has agency in their own lives begins in childhood. And with that, we will be able to really create the agency for long-term change in our societies. So I think we stand in a moment of extreme opportunity. So let's not lose that opportunity and make sure that we work together to capitalize on the changes that can be made possible in this moment in time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenna, both for the self-moderation as well as the highlights of the real moment of opportunity and momentum that we live in as well. I think we really agree with this. We're going to pass from Jenna directly to MEP Cindy Franson, who's from the EPP, but is also co-chair of the European Parliamentary Intergroup on the Fight Against Poverty. Cindy, thank you for joining us as well. Hopefully your video will come up shortly too. The Intergroup had its launch event a couple of weeks ago, Cindy, as you know, of course, looking at the impact of COVID. Maybe you could share some thoughts and some feedback from this launch event with the group today. To what extent do the views of the Intergroup coincide with what you've heard today? And what role do you see that the Intergroup will play in combating poverty in Europe in the coming years? Again, you have 5 minutes for the introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of the Intergroup, also on behalf of my colleague co-chair, Mr. Majorino, and our other members, Mrs. Matthias and Mrs. Toussaint. First of all, I want to congratulate you, the EAPN and its members organizations, to conducting an extensive survey on the impact of COVID-19 on people experiencing poverty and translating the study into real political recommendations. I would also like to thank those who participated in the survey and for sharing their thoughts. The concerns that are brought forward in the survey are very similar to the issues we discussed in the webinar organized by the Intergroup in June. In the past months, the European Union has taken action to combat the social and economic effects of the crisis, from very small scale initiatives to larger actions such as the Corona Response Initiative and the SURE initiative to protect jobs. But we cannot stop here. That's for clear. Our action must continue both on the short term to alleviate the hardest consequences of the pandemic, and on the long term to reduce poverty levels in Europe. And as the time is limited, I cannot reach in depth to all of these recommendations, but I would like to highlight a few. And I start with an adequate income. You call for urgent action to protect workers and ensure an adequate income for all. The European Commission has proposed a new instrument to fight the negative economic and social consequences of the coronavirus outbreak, providing assistance to address increases in public expenditure for the preservation of employment. This is an important instrument, I think, to preserve employment, but however, it is not enough. Still 10% of employed persons in the EU suffers from in-work poverty. We must continue to strive not only for a quantity of employment, but also for qualitative employment. And in the Commission, in the Ample Committee, we will focus on this item. We certainly will. The second item is jobs in terms of work. The situation is particularly hard for young people. We know that already before the crisis, young people had difficulties accessing quality jobs. Now with the crisis, it is even harder for them to find an appropriate job. And it remains important to invest in young people. The Youth Employment Initiative is one way to do so, but also equal access to quality education, investing in digital skills, and investing in children from a young age. And that brings me to the third issue, the children. They were disproportionately affected by the crisis, as mentioned by the former speaker. Schools closed and education went digital. But not all children had access to the necessary tools and support systems to benefit from digital education. And the Intergroup believes that children should be at the heart of the recovery plan. According to Professor and Nobel Prize winner Heckman, early education spending yields an annual lifetime return to society of up to 10%. Schools, civil society organizations and governments tried their best to make sure all children had the tools needed. But on the long term, we need to look further than that. The European Child Guarantee will be a crucial instrument. However, every child in Europe needs to have access to the most basic rights like education and healthcare. The Intergroup therefore calls for a Council recommendation on the Child Guarantee set within the framework of the pillar approach of the Investing in Children recommendation. Then the fourth item, food aid. Learning when you're hungry is difficult. We know that, and food banks in Europe have received a substantial increase in demands. The new report shows us the long waiting lines of people pushed into poverty by the crisis. The Fund for European Aid of the Most Deprived has been made more flexible and stronger to respond to this. It is necessary to have a continued support for this fund to ensure organizations and institutions can react to the most dire needs. And then the need, maybe the most strong one, the need for an ambitious European anti-poverty strategy. Last but not least, the Intergroup calls for an overarching European anti-poverty strategy with ambitious targets for reducing poverty and ending extreme poverty in Europe by 2030. The European Pillar of Social Rights has to be the compass to do it. And we, I mean the European Parliament, social partners, civil society, and people, really people experiencing poverty or social exclusion, we have to work hard and move forward step by step to make the rights and principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights effective and relevant for people. And as Angela Merkel said last week in the European Parliament, Europe is capable of achieving great things if we work together and stand together in solidarity. So at the Intergroup, we really want to work on all these issues. We also have a statement that we can share with everyone here in the group on behalf of the webinar we had last month, also on the COVID consequences and the pandemic's poverty politics was the name of the webinar. So we have a statement with also 6 demands on it, together with the organizations, together with you, with the EAPN. We made this together, and we shall put this also on the table. What is coming for the next year? We will put many issues on the agenda, but the first issues we want to speak about is the child guarantee, homelessness, European funding instruments that can help to eradicate poverty, but also the Green Deal. A transition into a green economy has to be a socially fair transition. The mechanisms to safeguard against poverty related to COVID-19 were thoroughly discussed during our webinar in the beginning of June and were merged into a call to action. Some of those calls I already highlighted earlier, and we hope and we will strive as an intergroup to make sure these calls to action become a reality. We hope to work together with you, both the organizations here and people experiencing poverty or social exclusion, to improve the situation of poverty in Europe. I hope I was in my time limit.
Thanks so much, Cindy. We're a little over time, but as Jenna said, participation is really at the heart of EAPN. So we're gonna continue and take a couple of questions. There was a question, first of all, from Anne van Lanka, which I think is directed at Mr. Doel from the German Ministry. And then Fran from the International Federation of Social Workers, I believe, has a question for Jenna. So Anne, and then Fran, I'll come to the two of you first. If you can put your videos on, perhaps, and Rebecca will unmute you.
Hi, Leo. Thank you for giving me the floor. It was not really a question, but it was like more of a comment. I think that the ambitions of the German presidency with regard to the social policies and employment policies are very, very big. But the problem is that you need to combine these things with, of course, adequate economic and budgetary policies. And there we hear again that there is, of course, the investment initiative, which is great, but at the same time, there's discussions running on reinstalling the force of the Stability and Growth Pact. And I wanted to know how we can ensure that these things will be kept coherent and do not undermine each other. Because it's all very, very nice to have a European investment strategy to allow people to lift their income situation, but at the same time reducing the national possibilities to do the same things. So that's a bit of my question. And then, yes, wish them very good luck on their initiatives on the European minimum income. I think this is an opportunity for all of us to push our national governments to support the German initiative and support the framework directive for minimum income.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Mr. Dull, we'll wait for the question from Fran as well before coming back to you. So Fran, if you can put your video on, and Rebecca will unmute you. You can ask your question.
Hi, it was really more of a comment again. I was very pleased to hear the point that Jenna made about wishing to add as a priority access to family support. Just to say that IFSW has been lobbying for access to social services to be part of Principle 20 of the Pillar of Social Rights, and we feel that is a big omission, and that many of the other things can't happen unless people are empowered through other support mechanisms to achieve what they want for their lives. So we would be very keen to work with you on that area. So thank you very much for adding it.
Okay, thanks, Fran. I believe there's one more question actually, which I'll take before coming back to panelists. Joe from EAPN in the Netherlands, I believe, has a question, which I think is for Esther. Joe, similar setup, if you can stick your video on and we'll unmute you. Oh, I think Joe may have a problem with his video. So Joe, I think you're unmuted, so you can ask your question. Okay, it seems that we have some issue with Joe's audio. So I'm just looking at the chat. Maybe either Rebecca or Sean could help me out because they were monitoring the chat. So I'm not quite sure what that question was. Rebecca or Sean, do you? Okay, while we're waiting for that, I'm going to come back, if I may, to Mr. Dull for the question from Anne, the question around how we can go about ensuring coherency of kind of economic and social policy at the European level. And Mr. Dull, would you care to share a couple of thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Anne van Lanker has put a quite complex question. To be honest, our position on the side of the Federal Ministry for Labour and Social Affairs is that that we want to be involved in the recovery schemes and put in the questions of social aspects and make it as coherent as possible. But as we all know, there are different players in this field, and I'm only part of this game. So I think the necessity is recognized, and I refer to the former contributions that there will be maybe a difference between the crisis of the year 2008 or following to this situation. I think I'm also on the side of this contribution that there is a momentum to have such a discussion. And in this context, our idea to have a union of strong welfare states is so crucial. I think the economic aspects of this are more recognized than before, and I understand the fears that there are already some signs that austerity will come up again, but I think our initiative is an example to safeguard these aspects and to promote the idea that we have a Europe of minimum standards and to have a threshold in the way Esther Lynch describes in the area of salaries as well as social protection. And I read a lot of this chat box, and there's an ongoing debate about is it good to have a directive when it's not feasible to have a majority between the member states. And this is, I think, is an ongoing process. We are not in the position to come to a final end during our presidency. We are the part of this to promote this idea that common standards are good in all the areas I mentioned: access, adequacy, and enabling aspects. And I think the scope of a possible legal instrument in the area of minimum income will depend what is the quality of the legal act. It's interconnected. But we are still in the first stage of this discussion. I think we, as a German presidency, will have the role of an honest broker between the interests of the member states, and I'm quite keen to hear the reactions of the member states in the next few days. But I'm sure that we will use all the opportunities during our presidency to promote this idea that it should be an ambitious initiative. So, for instance, I mentioned it. Many of you will have already an invitation. We will promote the idea on our major conference in September again. And so I think only the debate to say what is the necessity to come forward and build on all the activities I mentioned is this what we can achieve at the moment. But I'm honest, it's a moving target still, and try to be as ambitious as.
Okay, thank you. We've had various comments in the chat box, looking at how basic hourly wages are calculated, etc. as well. But because we're slightly behind time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the other three panelists maybe if they have if they'd like to come back on any of the questions, both from Fran and or the question from Joe I just referred to, or others in the chat box, but maybe also as a kind of closing statement as well, and then we'll move on to the concluding remarks from colleagues. So I'm going to come to Jenna first, because there was a direct question and comment to you from Fran as well. So back to you, Jenna, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. So yeah, I'll come back to Fran's question, but also link it to some of the comments and discussion in the chat box. Frank made a very pertinent reflection that if we do manage to get the 5% of the ESF plus dedicated to the child guarantee, which is even that is a big ask, but if we were to get it, then it would be €2.50 per child living in poverty, and that's not going to be able to shift the dial very much in outcomes for children. So yes, it's all about how are we channeling the political momentum and the financial resources to shift the structural investments in member states to improve outcomes for vulnerable children and families. Right now, the only real indicator we have to monitor progress is the EAPN indicator on child poverty and household poverty and material deprivation. And we want to be able to broaden out this focus on the situation of children. And one of the ways that we want to do that is to bring in reflections on children in care. Now, children in care are a very small number proportionate to the number of children, but it's a reflection on the fault lines in our systems, that there are children falling through the nets. And I think, as Olivier mentioned in his intervention, it's one of the fundamental rights violations of vulnerable families to have their children at risk of being separated, often due to extreme poverty, whether that be risk of eviction, homelessness, or so our aim is to really invest in family support and prevent separation of children, and to ensure that all families can protect their own children in their own biological families. And so we are looking to get some benchmark indicators around children in alternative care systems, and using that as an entry point to show how systems can be reformed. So that's one of the areas that we think is a key opportunity within the child guarantee. But I think my overall reflection is that we must not see these initiatives at EU level as being the solution. They are only a tool. They are an instrument which we need to use as European civil society networks to put pressure on national governments to reform their systems according to where they are at in the biggest needs that will make the biggest difference to vulnerable children and families in their contexts. So I think we need to resist being too prescriptive. But we do need to have a very strong, robust, enabling framework for the money to be used in the most effective way, and for the political agenda to make demands on member states so that they are not allowed to get away with misinvestment or doing nothing. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. Esther, I know you were a little rushed for time at the end of your intervention. Would you like to spend a minute kind of coming back on the issue of hourly wages, or anything else you may have seen in the chat as your closing remarks?
Yeah, sure. I'm actually really encouraged by the chat. So thanks to everybody for those encouraging remarks, and for sure it's all to play for during the German presidency, and I think it could be a real turning point for Europe. I want to talk a little bit about those workers who are excluded, either because of the very few hours of work that they have, or because the employer refuses to recognize that they are indeed an employee and pretends instead that they're self-employed workers. For us, this is all about power relationships. And this is a story that's over 100 years old. So our great-grandparents fought this fight. Our great-grandparents had to fight to say that an employer has responsibilities towards his or her workforce. So we fought it before, we can fight it again. So for us, we want to make sure that simply because you call somebody self-employed doesn't mean that you don't have responsibilities for their health and safety, to pay them a fair and adequate wage, that they can join the union and bargain, and importantly, that if they get sick or lose their job, that they have adequate safety nets in place. So I wanted to assure the EAPN that we absolutely recognise this as a problem, and we have a strategy in place. And we also recognise that there's a lot of rules that currently exist in Europe and they're simply not being enforced. And the people who find it hardest to get their rights are people who don't have access to courts. And again, to thank the EAPN for the work that you do in that, but also a plea to the Commission that you would begin to recognise the importance of collective complaints, so that trade unions could take complaints on behalf of groups of people rather than have to be worker by worker by worker, because in that circumstance the employer simply dismisses the person, and then people get scared and fearful about standing up for their rights. And my final point is to say, somewhere in all of this we have to address the lack of respect for workers who are low paid and people who rely on social safety, security nets for their income. we could do that. That wouldn't cost us anything. Right, and I think it would be really important. And I'm not talking about clapping and applauding. What I'm talking about is helping people so that when you engage with the services, that the approach is to help you, not to make it even more difficult than your life already is, to make it easy to fill in forms, to get the information across to you in an easy way, and to make it so that you're not fearful when you have a job and you go looking for income payments as a supplement, that your employer doesn't say, I can do without a phone call from the social services, so I prefer, I don't want that hassle in the workplace here, so I prefer if you would leave. And I think it would be important that services were just aware of just how precarious people who work in low paid occupations are, and to think about respect for people who turn up as themselves, and try and get their rights and entitlements, and just reach a brick wall. So I think that needs to be also part of our discussions.
Great, thank you, Esther. Cindy, I'm gonna offer you the opportunity to come back in for a final, whether you want to have a final reflection on some of the questions or the comments or the chat as well. If you'd like to come back in for a final closing remark as well.
I will. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I will be very short. I think the intergroup wants to keep this fight high on the political agenda by organizing meetings with people experiencing poverty and civil society organizations working on this matter. Also by translating this into our political work, shoulder by shoulder, over the frontiers of political groups. We have to do this together. We can table amendments. We will take initiatives towards the European Commission, propose pilot projects, and we will strive to make sure that an ambitious action plan to combat poverty will become a reality. I think as a parliament, it's our duty to work for this, and also as an intergroup, we should do this.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Cindy. I think we're all looking forward to having strong allies within the Parliament to take this fight forward. So thank you to the panelists to start with, to Cindy, to Herbert, to Jenna, and to Esther. I'm going to offer once again a virtual round of applause and a thank you for all of you. Thanks also to all colleagues for the great questions and the comments in the chat as well. We're going to move into the final session now, which is the wrap up, the concluding remarks. And in order to help us do this, I'm happy to call on the expertise of two colleagues. So firstly, we're going to hear from Katarina Ivankovic-Nestovic, who's Director of Social Policy within DG Employment, and then Maria Babovic, who's the co-chair of the EU, the EAPN Inclusion Strategies Group, and from EAPN Serbia. Katarina, we're going to start with you, if I may. Welcome to the call, and thanks for bearing with us. Katarina, perhaps you could sum up the Commission's reaction, perhaps, to the study, and focus more on some of the key next steps from your perspective on ensuring short and long-term results. Maybe again with a focus on minimum income, anti-poverty strategies, and the pillar of social rights. Thanks.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you, EAPN, for organizing this virtual meeting. And I think this is going to be our reality for the time that is coming, and we will see what will happen with the COVID-19 and how it will strike during the summer and in the autumn. But actually, we see already that many of our activities are either being postponed or are being just cancelled, which is a pity. But nevertheless, we have to continue working. I have been taking notes, which I haven't done, I have to say, in quite a long time. And this was a real pleasure for me also to listen. And when you say, we speak among each other, I think I appreciate a lot that I'm among you who have been speaking today, as well as my colleagues from the Commission and the Parliament. And I think it's very important for all of us to hear that. And I think it's even more important, let me briefly then just reflect to what Jenna was saying about speaking to the member states and hearing the voices of the member states. It is so closely linked with our action plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights. It's so linked with the overall anti-poverty strategic framework that we want to put in place, because we don't have to speak between each other at the EU level, and if we would be speaking between each other only at the EU level, we would not get much further, because the real action and the real activities and the real people are in the member states, and they are those who are implementing actions. When we say the member states, it is also important to speak about all the level of the member states, so the national level, but regional and local, because where are the schools, where are the hospitals, where should we provide the home-based care, and where should we provide the community-based services? So these are all important elements. And then with whom? So with whom? With all the authorities, with the social partners. And Esther, you spoke so nicely about coordinated response on various initiatives. I think this is the crucial element, and this is what we, in the European Pillar of Social Rights and in our action plan, are going to try to show that indeed, yes, in order to fight certain elements, in order to fight inequalities, in order to fight poverty, we need to have integrated and coordinated responses. Is it on children? I hate when we simplify like this, when we say 2.5 euro for a child, which is really putting it to such a superficial level, because even if we use much more money envisaged in the ESF Plus, it wouldn't be sufficient. And I think it's so clear to everybody that the child guarantee and the child poverty cannot be fight with 5% of ESF Plus. It needs to strike another funding. We need to see how the member states are going to respond, and then we focus in children in need, that they have affordable or free. Very affordable is not an option, where we have to have the free access to certain elements. Then it should be as well for the children most in need. And we don't speak about all the children, and we are very much aware in which areas the poverty is mostly difficult and where equal opportunities are most challenging. Early childcare, education, nutrition, health, and also all the other elements relevant for active inclusion and for inclusion of children in the community, sport, leisure, culture, all these elements where children, and I come back to Sonia, when you said if you don't participate, you become invisible. And I think this is what needs to be avoided in all age cohorts. But imagine when you are a child and you feel invisible because you can't participate, the frustration is even bigger, and this frustration leads to the further consequences in the education and then in the labor market. So thank you, Sonia, for reminding us on this important element and having it here. So we spoke a lot about minimum wage. We spoke a lot about minimum income. And I would just also like to thank to Herbert and his colleagues who are working on the minimum income. And indeed, on Thursday, our colleagues are going to have, and not only our colleagues, the whole Social Question Working Party is going to have an exchange on the minimum income and the principles that want to be there. You are fully aware that I cannot share with you which form we would like to and which form do we prefer, because in the end I think it's really important as a commissioner and as Herbert have said, to put on the table areas, to put on the table points on benefits, point on active inclusion, access to services, monitoring systems, monitoring mechanisms, and really making the social safety net as the net of the various elements, and trying to address them and trying to see them, of course, building on 1992 and 2008, but really also being fully aware why some things haven't worked. Is it due to the fact that those were Commission or Council recommendation, or what is there in question? And we saw in the opening, as when Carlos was having his opening remarks, yes, the member states have responded so differently on the crisis, but we see that some groups were really much more hit than the others. And it goes from the women, from elderly, for homeless, for atypical and self-employed workers, for low-income households, children in poor families, travelers, Roma, migrants, and asylum seekers. It's a wide range of the most disadvantaged. And if the corona crisis continues as it has been so far, I think the member states really will have to move from addressing social aspects as social spending, but really addressing it as social investments. And this is what Commissioner mentioned in his speech. And this is this change of paradigm that is needed, where we see really social actions and as a social investment and investment in the future. And then if we look who was most valuable during the crisis, the nurses, workers in the grocery stores, informal caregivers, which are also on the line of the low-paid professions all over in all of our member states. This also has to do something who is bearing the consequences of the crisis and how this should be absorbed and addressed as well. We spoke a lot about homelessness, and yes, Commissioner has announced that we are working on a plan how to try to eradicate the homelessness, and the ideas are quite clear that we need to get on board as many stakeholders as possible, not only at the level of member states, but at the level of the overall union, I would dare to say, and all of those who contribute to eradication of homelessness. Could we have this ambitious goal? I think we should have, and we must have this ambitious goal. We just cannot disregard the fact that we are now, with all the crises and with all the problems, we are now at the beginning of the new financial era. We see that there is going to be more money than ever. We have now CRIC and CRI Plus, which are already showing the effects where member states reallocate from one fund to another. And then, of course, some of the member states complained that there wasn't much fresh money left, but then still they managed to find some cohesion money that could be spent for the ESF type of activities. But now we have the whole MFF package, we have the Next Generation EU, we have different instruments that are going to be able to combine and to address challenges. And for example, when we speak about housing or when we speak about social services, there is going to be a lot of fresh money that could be invested, and therefore it's even more important to be on the ground, to speak to the member states, to speak to those who are programming those funds, because it's not only that we at EU level put some areas in the perspective, it needs to be implemented at the national level. So if it is not programmed, then it's not a priority for the XY member state. And it doesn't matter how hard we push at EU level, if the member states decide to put priorities in a different order, that's their right. And I think the lobbying time and the really huge activism is now. And maybe this COVID crisis is an opportunity, as the programs have not been programmed yet, and as we see those new instruments, this is also very important to have in mind and to see. And I have this kind gentle reminder from Leo. Yes, Leo, I'm coming to the end. So I hope you recognize that you have a good partner in the Commission. I hope you're recognizing that you have a good partner in DG Employment. I hope we are somehow your arms, if I can say, in the European Commission, and also that we are those who are passing the message to other stakeholders as well. I think it's extremely important that we continue our dialogues, that we continue our discussion. We are going to have many more starting in autumn, also on the various initiatives. There will be a round of our communication on the child guarantee. We are going to discuss the minimum income at certain stage. We are going to discuss the homelessness and the housing eradication. We are going to discuss energy poverty. The Commissioner mentioned it. and I'm not going to refer back to this aspect. Of course, the minimum wage continues, but there are also issues we did not speak about them today. It's a long-term care that is an area that requires additional support. We will have the new disability strategy, and also it is important to put the various elements relevant to the persons with disabilities in the light of the poverty and anti-poverty measures. And also there are other various instruments, youth employment, new skills agenda, trying to put people experiencing poverty, returning them to the labor market, and all those aspects that unfortunately we don't have time to discuss now, but I would just like to reassure you that we listen. We don't want anybody invisible. We don't want anybody to be lonely, and we don't want all of you to feel excluded from our actions. That's why we promote inclusion of all at all stages. So thank you. I hope I managed to summarize a bit, Leo, and I was too long, sorry.
That's perfect. No, thanks so much, Katerina. Thanks to the 106 of you who've borne with us a little later than we were anticipating as well. It was great to hear, I think, about your call for ambition as well, Katerina. I think it really goes hand in hand with what Jenna was saying about the opportunity and momentum that we have at the moment in terms of these areas. I think it's really the time for the anti-poverty sector more widely to be ambitious and bold, that there is this political space, that there's more initiatives, more money. And I think we certainly are seeing, more political will at the European and national level as well. And it's really heartening, I think, to hear your commitment to increase to continued dialogue as well. I mean, so we're looking forward to follow-up meetings on the various initiatives, the various areas that you mentioned, but also the next people experiencing poverty meeting as well, and the high-level commitments hopefully to that as well, hopefully early in the new year. I have the pleasure to invite my colleague Maria Babovic, as I said, the co-chair of our Inclusion Strategies Group. Maria, you have the honor of giving the concluding remarks and of formally closing the conference today. So I'm going to pass the word to you directly, and just to say thank you to all the speakers beforehand and to all the participants for being with us today. Maria, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for great contributions, really, panelists and very dynamic discussion in chat. It was really all contribution to make this conference really a great conference. And I can say that this conference actually has vividly highlighted the devastating impact of COVID-19 pandemics that we all felt and all across Europe. But we also know that impact was not the same for everybody, and our study and also other interventions that you could hear today have shown that virus is aggravating existing poverty and inequalities. Actually, it just revealed how much structural inequalities are deep and how much we have to do to fight them. So poor and vulnerable people are the main victims, and particularly older population, children, and especially children living in families with many children, those who are suffering from ill health or disability, workers on the front line in essential but often very low paid jobs, those suffering from exclusion and discrimination because they are homeless, because they are migrants, because they are asylum seekers, because they are Black or Roma or some other characteristics that make them very prone to some kind of discrimination. And we, of course, can't mention all of groups that are under risks of exclusion and suffering stronger impact of COVID pandemics. But we also have to say that inequalities have gender face, and women that were frontline workers and carrying the most of the unpaid care work in the families took much bigger burden, and especially in the harsh position were women who are single parents. So there are many groups that were under the impact of COVID-19 pandemics, and actually as we heard many times, Graciela already started with that, but we heard many times during discussions that each crisis poses challenges but also gives the opportunities. This crisis really flashlights the structural inequalities, but also gives us the opportunity, and also, as Jenna said, a momentum that we have to use. And if we are wise and if we are empowered, we have to use this to change certain things and enable some different processes that will close those structural gaps and inequalities. But what we experienced so far, unfortunately, we all are aware it's not the end, and many worse things maybe will come in the future. We know that the Commission is already predicting higher levels of poverty and social exclusion than after the crisis 2008, which affected over 123 million people. This conference strongly welcomed the short-term and innovative measures taken by the most national governments. The response by the EU supporting budget flexibility through the escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact, it seems crucial, as well as the initial recovery package proposals. But the challenges are also on the longer term. There are the questions, key questions: who will pay the price of recovery, of crisis and then recovery? How will the debt be closed? Who will gain from the new investment? And of course, I think we all agree that austerity has to be completely rejected as possible answer and as possible solution. We already experienced how was the impact when austerity was used as the answer to the crisis 2008. The European Union, the member states, as well as non-EU member states, non-EU countries in Europe, must urgently act to ensure that recovery measures are effective, that they reach people who are most affected. They must invest in a longer-term anti-poverty strategy that can guarantee social rights to an adequate income, to an essential and universal public services. They must protect employment and ensure that quality jobs are created and are accessible for excluded and vulnerable groups. The children, young people, and adults who are the worst affected must be listened to and seen also as somebody who actively contributes to the design of measures that will help to alleviate them from the consequences of COVID crisis and their possibly longer-term poverty and exclusion. There are certain recommendations that the EAPN likes to propose, and this includes something like, we put something like in 10 points. So first one is to ensure that current financial support measures prioritize protection of the poor and vulnerable and assesses the impact. So measures should be really based on one solid, comprehensive assessment on who is impacted worst and what are the appropriate tools to respond to the impact of the crisis on these specific groups. Secondly, to prioritize investment in universal free public health and social care, revaluing, which we heard many times, and compensating key workers and closing the inequality gap, paying attention to the social determinants of health inequalities, which are very deep and rooted in much deeper structural inequalities. Thirdly, to adopt an overarching EU social and sustainable post-2020 strategy or Agenda 2030 to drive an inclusive recovery, and that should be also underpinned by sustainable development goals and the European Pillar of Social Rights. Fourthly, to agree an integrated EU anti-poverty strategy, which EAPN strongly advocates for already some time, as the main goal and framework for the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan in 2020 that reinforces integrated support to social rights. To make European semester more social, ensuring poverty, inequality, and social rights are in equal focus like economic issues and also environmental objectives. To make progress on obligatory social rights, to propose a new framework directive to guarantee adequate minimum incomes and a new framework on fair minimum wages. to ensure the EU recovery plan benefits the poor and vulnerable, including through just transition, investing 30% of ESF plus on social inclusion, gender equality, and the fight against discrimination. Then to give priority to participation and democracy, creating meaningful dialogue with people experiencing poverty and civil society organizations is the inevitable ingredient component of these processes. To reject austerity in Europe and progress towards a macroeconomic framework that prioritizes the fight against poverty and inequality. And also, if I can say, coming from EU candidate country, not to forget to incorporate all of these aspects in EU enlargement policies, enabling recovery of candidate countries and also aspirant countries, and further reforms so they do not forget the people under risks of poverty and exclusion, or they do not go at the cost of social rights of those people trying to prioritize economic issues. So these will be some main conclusions. Probably I was not able to include everything that we spoke today, but I think these 10 key points give us good guidelines what we can do at EU, at national levels, and actually what we can do together, as this conference showed quite a great consensus of all those key points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that really comprehensive wrapping up. I think that's that really brings us to the end of the conference, colleagues. That's I think all that remains to be said is just a final thank you to everyone. Thank you to all the speakers for participating, to all EAPN members for their commitment, to all others who participated. So voila, thank you so much. We'll be sending further details and a report of the meeting to all participants in due course. Thanks so much and have a great evening. Thank you.